On Raglan Road on an autumn day, I saw her first and knew that her dark hair would weave a snare that I would one day rue. I saw the danger, yet I walked along the enchanted way, and I said, let grief be a falling leaf at the dawning of the day.
You're known as the Bull of Sheriff Street. The Bull has all sorts of meanings in literary terms and otherwise. How would you define it?
Well, you know, the Bull comes from my childhood. The title of the book that Adrian Fraser used was The Bull of Sheriff Street, which was a publisher's idea, and we used that. I became identified with that, but I never saw myself in that light, really. But when I was young, it was during the war, and I remember cattle down in Sheriff Street being exported to England by the million. They'd be coming down the road from the markets, and I'd be going into St. Lawrence O'Toole's school, and there were all these animals all around you. And eventually, the last thing to come down the road would be these old stud bulls on chains being led to the boat for England and their final hours. And that always impressed me. And then, of course, my grandfather was a farmer down in County Leash, and he bred cattle, and he had a dairy herd, and he had beef and dairy and so forth, on a smallish farm, but big enough to be worthwhile. And I used to go with my uncle over to the Bull. He didn't have a bull on his own farm, so we used a bull belonging to farmers called Hipwells. And Seamus Heaney has a wonderful poem about an old stud bull that he used to bring his father's cows to for service. And I saw all that activity. The bull as a symbol of life and life force. It's very hard to ignore it. It's all through Mediterranean culture, and practically every culture in the world that has to do with cattle and animals. And we in Ireland, as Adrian Fraser has said, are a cattle culture. All of our stories relate. The most famous story, Tom O'Coolia, is about a cattle raid, because cattle were everything. They represented wealth and exchange of all kinds. And if you hadn't got cattle, you were nobody. Well, I started sculpting when I was about 15, 16. And before that, I had been painting whilst at school in Sheriff Street, and later on in Marino when we moved there in 1946, 7, around that time. I really started sculpting after I started an apprenticeship in Jane C. McLaughlin's in Pearse Street in Dublin, which 1953 until 1960. There I was learning the trade of metalwork, making things, staircases, tabernacles, railings, structured steelwork, bits and pieces, and I worked on all metals. Out of that came a career of sculptor. As Patrick Kavanagh said one time, you dabble in verse and you end up as a poet. Well, I dabbled in metal and became a sculptor. I was an apprentice from 8 o'clock in the morning until 5:15 or something like that, 5:30 in the afternoon. Then I went home, had my tea, and came back into the College of Art 2 or 3 nights a week. And of course, the most important thing to happen there was to associate with other artists. College of Art was a very limited space, and you had over 90 people there, so it was a tight fit, but the classes at night were full of people who wanted to work, and Maurice McGonigal always said that he felt that night students were very serious, and in some ways more serious than some of the day students. And he always liked to see that. And out of that came several artists who persisted. John Kelly, who later taught in the College of Art, NCAD, as a printmaker, and Joseph O'Connor, and the day students then that I associated with were Charles Cullen, Leon the Sashi, Joe Dolan, and Tig McSweeney, and out of that came the New Artist Group in 1963. And at that time, I was working part-time in the sugar company. They were doing a campaign of installing machineries. Ardent Foods were involved just before that. And I was working in Carlow. I used to be on night shifts, and I made pieces of Sculptor out of old machinery. In 1963, whilst I was in Carlow, we had an exhibition the year before in Dublin of the New Artist Group. I set up, in collaboration with Oliver Snoddy, Parley Goes Snoddy the poet, an exhibition in the Town Hall in Carlow. And it was the first exhibition in Carlow since 1863, when an army officer's wife, a garrisoned in Carlow, had an exhibition of watercolours. After that then, there was various exhibitions. There was Rising Ground. James McKenna organised that. And running parallel to all this was the independent artists, who had all the important artists of the modern era there: Barry Cook and Camille Suter, Patrick Pye, Michael Caine, several others. Times were changing, and there was more money coming into the economy, and you could sell small paintings and small pieces of sculpture. And this was a real progress, because Maurice McGonigal told me that in the 30s, when he was a young man, if you sold a painting for £5, it was a triumph. He went out and he got drunk for a week. He said it was just the beginning of the modern era. There were older artists established RHAs like Keating and McGonigal and various people who exhibited in the Richie Hendricks and the Dawson Gallery, Nora McGuinness and others, and Yeats. That was the mixture you had. There's a wonderful description of the mid-60s in the memoirs of the novelist John Banville, and that gives you some flavour of what it was like to be around that area. And it was the heart and the core in Ireland of the arts at that time. Eddie Delaney was the first one to put on a full one-person show of sculpture in Dublin at that time. He'd come back from Germany and Italy, where he'd learned about bronze casting. And I worked with Eddie 65, 66, 67, and I helped him to cast the Wolfe Tone statue. But Eddie was, he worked on his own. So did Werner Schurman, who was an excellent bronze caster. But they only produced a certain amount, and it was mainly for themselves, one or two other artists. And I could see, having my experience in engineering and the foundry background that I came from, that there was a need for an all-year round foundry in Ireland. So in 1970, myself and a man called Tony Stevenson and Peter O'Brien, who was the father of Colm, who was later head of the director of the Arts Council, we got together and we set up a place to cast metal, bronze mainly, some aluminium, bit of brass, bit of silver, but that was in Rostrevor Terrace, which is off Mackin Street, near Pierce Street in Dublin. And we were there for years, and Leo Higgins joined us then around 73, 74, and we had a full-time foundry working 6 days a week. Sometimes we'd be working 7 days, so it was a very active place. And that was the first time ever that you had a foundry casting statuary. We were the first ones that sculptors could come to, and we cast full-size statues and monumental sculpture even. And we discovered, as welding progressed, we could use welding technology, which was a huge help. We could section let's say, a figure of 6-7 feet into two sections, then weld it around the middle, because otherwise you'd have huge molds that you needed huge equipment, and we didn't have that. We were working like bespoke, handmade stuff.
You didn't seem to get a lot of help from the Arts Council in setting up this foundry.
No, I sent in a letter explaining what was happening to, and Father O'Sullivan was the SJ, was the head of the council, and the letter came back immediately saying no, just no, that's it. We weren't influential in the kind of the upper echelons of the arts in Ireland. I don't know how they saw us, but they certainly did. They weren't helpful at all. they dismissed us.
But you reacted to that in a way that you thought that they should be disbanded and that they were only catering for a certain.
Oh, they were.
Group.
I mean, I spoke to David Hendry, and he ran the Richie Hendricks Gallery, and he said to me, "Oh, art is for snobs, really. It's not for the ordinary people." And of course, that was like red rag to a bull to me and my other colleagues like Michael Caine, James McKenna, Breen Burke, and a whole load of the younger people. And we rejected that idea. And at one stage, I think it was James McKenna said, "We must kill the Arts Council." It was pretty dramatic stuff going on. And there was a journalist called Tony Butler. He publicised all this, and it was headlines in the evening press at one stage. And we used to, when Charlie Haughey would come to exhibitions to open them or whatever, much to his amusement, he would find placards and like trade union movement against the establishment. And the 60s then ended with a huge strike in the College of Art. The students were locked out eventually. There was huge disruption. The whole educational programme had to be examined and restructured, and it took a long time. But that was the end of the 60s, leading into the 70s. And I became a teacher of life drawing in Trinity College, who housed that activity for the students who were locked out of the College of Art. And Michael Farrell was another one. Breen Burke did some work there, life drawing.
Well, we think of you primarily as a sculptor, but you were also involved in theatre design. How did that affect your career?
When we started Project Gallery in 1966-67, around that period, there was a season of theatre put on by Colm O'Brien and Jim Fitzgerald in the Gate Theatre. They had 3 plays. They had a play by Pinter, I think it was Lovers, and they had a play by a man called Murray Shisgal, who was a New York playwright, and James Saunders, who was a London playwright. And they had 3 one-act plays and no one to design the set. And they looked at me and Jim said, "You do it, Bean, you're able to paint, aren't you?" And so I got the job. There was young actors from Trinity College, and they were a huge success, and the set got terrific notice and so forth. I also designed sets for Tom Kilroy's play, The Death and Resurrection of Mr. Roach. Tom Kilroy wrote that for Dublin Theatre Festival, and I designed a set for that, again with Jim Fitzgerald, who was a wonderful director, most imaginative, skillful man. I worked with Jim for years. I did a set for the Abbey. I did some other work as well. I became a set designer by accident, and I worked before that in the Abbey as a set painter with Brian Collins. So I was involved with the graphic studio as well, was a member there. So it was all action. I didn't have much time for anything else except the arts. And for the whole of 1970, 60s into the 70s, I worked for practically nothing, That didn't matter. I did it willingly, and I had a great love for what I was doing. So it wasn't a task to me, it was love.
You were recently in Greece. Tell me a little bit about that.
My agenda was to try and get in touch with the refugee situation, and I didn't get as far as where it really was. It wasn't around Athens, as I discovered, and I hadn't got that much time. But I went and got in touch with the embassy, and they didn't know much about it. They didn't have access to that kind of material that I was looking for. I went to Piraeus, and I saw the wonderful collection of archaeological stuff there, and at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. That's as far as I got, but I will be going back again. I'm deeply interested in the refugee situation. They don't like to be called refugees. I suppose immigrant would be a better word, but to me the modern refugee situation has a huge parallel identity, as far as I'm concerned, with the Irish Famine, and that's my interest, working from there. I know that Brian Maguire has been in Syria recently, and he's done very good work on the crisis in Syria. And I think artists that have that vision of people and not just kind of making pleasant images or sensational images or anything like that, but the real situation. There are a number of artists who are serious about that, and I'm one of them. And it'll go on into next year. I hope to have an exhibition reflecting all that.
On Grafton Street in November, we tripped lightly along the ledge of a deep ravine where can be seen the worst of passions pledged. The Queen of Hearts still baking tarts, and I not making hay. Well, I love too much, and by such is happiness thrown away.